All right, everybody, we're going to get started. So find a seat if you haven't already. And thank you all for coming out on a beautiful summer night. Hopefully, I'll make it worth your while to be inside for a couple of hours, and then we'll be on our way. So we've got an exciting lineup tonight, some great talks. But before we dive into that, I want to take a second and thank our sponsors, and we'll give you just a quick some logistical updates on meetup topics. So first off, I should say hello. My name is Luke Melia. I'm the organizer of Ember.js NYC. We've been doing this for, I think, about 2.5 years now, and it just keeps getting better and better, thanks to, really to the amazing work that all of you, people do here in the room, and the wider Ember community around the world. So our sponsors one of our sponsors has been with us since almost the beginning, since our second meetup, and that's Pivotal Labs, where we are here today. They've been an amazing supporter of this group. For those of you who don't know, Pivotal Labs is an agile consulting firm that do everything from Ruby on Rails work to iOS to now I know a bunch more enterprise and Java stuff over the last year or two. If you need a great consulting firm, or you are looking to potentially work for a good consulting firm, you should definitely be thinking about Pivotal. Mike, are you around? So somewhere in the general area is a gentleman named Micah Young, who works here at Pivotal, and he'd be happy to talk with you. In addition to working here, he's also my brother-in-law, so I can vouch he's a good guy. I know, small world. So thanks to Pivotal. We also have a few other sponsors who have helped out a bunch. Simple Reach, represented here in the front row by Andre and Hajan, are one of our sponsors of our Hacker Hours nights, which are smaller, more hands-on code nights. We had a really awesome night a couple of weeks ago there. And then Movable Link also has been sponsoring our Hacker Hours events and hosting them as well. And we had a great workshop that Matthew Beal did about the Ember run loop recently there. And Matthew is now in Barcelona giving that workshop at Emberfest there. So it'll be exciting to see everything that comes out of that. So a couple of quick pieces of news from the Ember world, and then I'm going to open up the floor to announcements for anybody, any of you, so be thinking about that. Recently dropped is Ember 1.7.0. Came out not too long ago. Some key things is that query params are enabled by default. Alex Machinier, one of our speakers tonight, has spent untold hours, blood, sweat, and tears making this possible just for you. So thank you, Alex. We also have being able to nest this.route in the router DSL, which is great for kind of being able to be explicit about how your routes are named, as opposed to being limited to 2 levels. And lots of other perf stuff. I want to do a quick call out. I noticed Adrian is over here having a slice. My company did some work with Adrian and his team recently over at Capital IQ downtown, and a lot of that work was really focused on, well, actually 2 things. One of them was a big focus was on performance tuning. And we dug into a bunch of Ember and Ember data and made things faster, a lot of which is in this 1.70 release, some of which will land in 1.80. That affects everybody's apps. And it obviously affects Adrian's app also, but affects the whole, all Ember users, which is fantastic. There's also a project that we had started before working with Adrian, but refined then, which is called Draggable Each. And it's basically a helper that will let you easily do drag drop kind of almost as easily as just doing a pound each helper. So if you're interested in that, we're still kind of getting docs and stuff together for it, but Dennis Nazarov has been involved in packaging that as an Ember CLI add-on, and he can talk with you about it, or I can as well. And that reminds me, I forgot to thank my own company as a sponsor. Shameless self-promotion. Yap Labs is a Ember training consulting firm. We work with a bunch of companies around New York, and our goal is really just to help people be more successful, help teams be more successful with Ember. So with that, I want to turn the floor over to anybody who has announcements. This can be events, hiring, you name it. Hassan?
Hi everyone, my name's Hassan. I work with MHE Education, and we are looking for some Ember developers to work on some pretty cool stuff. We're actually working with one of the core team members, Robert Jackson, and it's a really awesome opportunity. If you're interested, come see me afterwards. And also, if you like this shirt, we have some stickers right over there by the pizzas. Help yourself.
Awesome.
Hey, I'm Andre. As Luke mentioned, with SimpleReach, we are the standard in content measurement and distribution, and we use a lot of cool technology, including Ember. We have about 4 people that work in our Ember team right now. We want to add 2 more. We're building lots of things really quickly, so come chat to me if you're looking.
Cool. Anybody else? I can just say that I have worked closely with in various projects stuff with both Hassan and Andre, and I can vouch for both of them. They're both great guys, great developers, and if you are somebody who happens to be looking, you could do no wrong working with these guys. Cool. So with that, I want to introduce our first speakers. These gentlemen are friends of our EmberNYC's longtime friend Chris C. And when they got in touch through an introduction there and showed me, told me a little bit about what they were working on, I said, like, you guys should definitely demo this and share a little bit about your experience with Ember so far. So please join me in welcoming Jake Grinstead of Simply 360 and Chris Santera. Awesome. So we're going to get Chris to plug in. We'll get rolling. That's
Simply 360. Hi everybody. This is our first Ember meetup, and we're really excited to be here. Thank you, Chris, for inviting us, and thanks for having us. We just got started with Ember. We're new to the game and with Ember, and really excited. So we wanted to share a little bit about our experience getting up and running. We just started in April, putting things together, putting ideas together. So we're a new startup that's now actually building the app that we want to build. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing. We actually started and met at the Fresh Air Fund, which is an organization that's been around in New York City for a very long time, 137 years, serving children in the toughest neighborhoods of New York. That was my passion that I moved here from England to work on. And when I got to the Fresh Air Fund, the management of data was a mess. And that is something that sort of is across a lot of nonprofits in New York City. We've noticed that a lot of people don't have good databases to manage the people that they're serving, to manage the programs that they're running. And at the Fresh Air Fund, I mean, programs absolutely incredible, but behind the scenes, they were still using paper files, they were still using Microsoft Excel, they were still using Lotus Approach. And this wasn't that long ago, but so when I got there, I realized that something had to be done. And so just sort of in my spare time, started building an app that would be able to manage the people that we were serving. So we created this software called Fresh Air Live, or Flive as it became known over time. And Flive manages now about 1 million people and is logged into by about 1,000 people each summer to manage those children. Each year, the Fresh Air Fund sends about 10,000 children on vacation. So this is a big organization with a big reach. But we wanted to take it a step further, and we noticed that the donor database, obviously we're managing fundraising for an organization like this. We're also managing a lot of volunteers. The Fresh Air Fund is incredibly volunteer-centric, and also managing staff. Each summer, we run 5 summer camps with about 500 staff who come and go each year. So there was these 4 databases, the children, the staff, the volunteers, and the donors, all running completely independently of each other, and we wanted to do something about that, so we started to bring them all together. We soon realized that this was something that needed to be done across the industry, and over the last 13 years of working in the nonprofit world, I came to the conclusion that IT in nonprofit really, really sucks and needs help. And there are some really great consulting firms out there and some great companies that help with the IT sector. But what we wanted to do, and there are some really big players as well, like multinational, giant, billion-dollar corporations that are working to bring software to the nonprofit world as well. But what we wanted to do is make something that was sort of from the inside. And so we wanted to build something with our knowledge of what was best for nonprofits that would really work well for the community and be really easy to use. So we wanted to make something generic that would work across a lot of organizations, and we came up with Simply 360. So we're building this, basically a CRM, a constituent relationship management platform, like Salesforce, but we're building it specifically for nonprofits to make it really simple. One of the things that we thought was really important about building this for nonprofits that we're able to do differently because the nonprofit industry doesn't really have competition is that we want to use the data that we collect. Obviously, our vision is to be able to be used by a lot of nonprofits across the country. And we want to use the data that we collect from these nonprofits to help other nonprofits, to help each other. So we're collecting that big data. I have no idea how to do that yet. We're going to be hiring someone, hopefully, at some point to tell me how to do that. But we want to collect all of that data from all of the nonprofits that we're serving and use it to help others. So like a homeless shelter in Brooklyn might be seeing hundreds of people every day and gathering data about when they come, what they need to eat, how much it's costing, where they're getting donations from, all sorts of different things. That information could be shared without them having to worry about it, without them having to think about it, through Simply 360 with any other homeless shelter using Simply 360 as well. So we want to share the data across the industry, which is obviously something in the nonprofit world everyone's going to love and want to do because we want each other to succeed because we've all got the same missions. So one of the things that we wanted to do, this sharing of data, this moving of data between organizations, between entities, we came up on our own with this idea of seeing, we're looking around at places like Facebook and Windows and Google now and seeing this card metaphor. And we wanted to use cards to display and contain information about things and people and events and experiences and stuff, and use the cards to share that information across the entire application and across the entire community. And that's how we ended up meeting Chris. Chris is running this amazing project called CardStack. And CardStack is a way to basically use the card metaphor, but take it a step further and use it to really be able to share data between applications and between different disparate places where data might be coming from. So we actually want to take it and think about using that in what we're doing. So we're going to be working a little bit with him to try and figure out how we can collaborate on this. But we think it's really important to, especially in the nonprofit world, but I think it's going to become important everywhere, to be able to really share that data really easily. So just to give you a couple of examples, we're going to run a little demo of Simply 360. So this is obviously just being built right now, so excuse our bugs or whatever else goes on the screen now. But this is an example of looking at a person's record. I think the person's really cute, if you think so too. The pictures obviously will go up in the corner. But this would be a simple record, and all the information that we store about a person would be in cards. So if we go to like our contact details tab, we'd see different cards with the different contact details. We might go to our relationships and see the different relationships that they have with these other people. Photos and media, we're going to see cards that have different places that these people have been in photos for or whatever. And I think each of these places, there is opportunity to bring data externally as well, and to pull, for example, here we might have a YouTube video. On the contact details, we might have a Twitter feed. There might be different data from external sources that we want to pull in and have cards displaying here. And so we're using and talking about using CardStack to have a way to pull that information. I'm not going to go into everything about that. If you're interested in it, check out cardstack.io. It's really cool, and hopefully we'll work more with Ember as we go forwards. All right, so what do I want to talk about now? So basically, this is from Fresh Air Fund, from from Fresh Air Live. We developed this for the whole industry. At the Fresh Air Fund, as a nonprofit, we had a lot of stuff donated from Microsoft. So we were a Microsoft shop. Everything was, using ASP.NET, Visual Studio, SQL Server. That was our entire world. So this was new for us to move away from that finally. But that's not really what I'm good at. That's what Chris is good at. So he's going to talk to you more about that. Chris is our head programmer, CTO. So he's going to talk to you about what it is that we've actually done and why we chose Ember. Thank you.
Okay. Our background is in ASP.NET, which if you're familiar with, you probably have, or know the terms yellow screen of death and post-back hell. To be fair, ASP.NET really served us well for a long time, but as the years drew on, I found myself writing more and more JavaScript and less C#. When we decided to do Simply 360, we had to settle on a full software stack, and we decided that we needed very heavy JavaScript, and it wasn't long before we agreed that we needed to do a single-page application. So we looked at the usual suspects. We looked at, in addition to Ember, we looked at Angular, Meteor, Kendo UI, Durandal, but it was Ember that we came to in the end, for probably many of the reasons that all of you love Ember as well. The fixtures adapter is one of my favorite features. Being able to build out your prototype without needing to even think about making a server is just a real treat. The router, Ember's router is basically second to none among all the SPA frameworks we looked at. Just an example of creating that page that you saw of Joe Smith up there was just a giant chore in several of the other frameworks I looked at, and having that kind of tabbed navigation sort of thing was just a breeze in Ember. Ember CLI, well, I think Ivan is going to talk about that today. So there's not really much I can say that he's not going to say, but let me just suffice to say it's amazing. We've been using it since May, and it's been a lot of fun watching it grow since then. Ember's testing framework is really intuitive, and I know a lot of us sometimes can slack a little bit when it comes to writing tests. Ember really gives you no excuse not to write really good tests. Ember's documentation is incredible. It helped me a lot with a lot of the problems I had. Just go to the docs, the answer's in there. And the community. Ember's community is awesome, as evidenced by all of you folks who are here tonight. So, of course, not everything is perfect. There have been a few bugs along the way. Most of them have been fixed relatively quickly, and the ones that weren't fixed, I would submit a pull request, somebody would help me, and we'd get it worked out. There's one thing I'd really like to mention that I struggled with for a couple days, a couple months ago, and coming from a C# background, I really have an affinity for strongly typed languages and design time checking. So I tried to get the language TypeScript working with Ember CLI, and I just couldn't kind of get it working. TypeScript, if you're not familiar with it, it's from Microsoft. It is open source. It's a strongly typed language that transpiles down to JavaScript, and I worked with it for about, I don't know, 6 to 8 months at the Fresh Air Fund, and using TypeScript caught a whole ton of bugs that would have crept through to runtime, and I could just catch them right in the editor. Not to mention, it also supports IntelliSense. I tried to get it working with Ember CLI. At the time, I really didn't know what I was doing, so I kind of didn't get it working. I'd really love to revisit this topic at some time in the future. Last thing I want to mention is we just had a few learning moments. I just want to mention a few learning moments I had while learning Ember. One of them is mix-ins. I've worked with several other JavaScript frameworks that offer this kind of object-oriented sort of paradigm that JavaScript doesn't have natively. And all of them feature single inheritance. Some of them have multiple inheritance, but Ember is the first one I've worked with that actually really promotes the use of mix-ins. and encourages them to you to use them. One example I have is that we have a sidebar. As you saw in the demo, a number of our pages feature this sidebar, but not all of them have the sidebar, and some of them have a slightly different sidebar. But the sidebar is a standard enough component that I wanted to expose it at the application layer. So I can just add a mix-in that says uses tabbed sidebar, for example, and put this on one of my routes, and then the route automatically has a tabbed sidebar with very little configuration necessary. This example up here allows you to say that any card that's displayed on the current page can be bookmarked. All I have to do is include this mix-in in one of my routes, and bam, it's there. Another learning moment I had was learning about the view layer. Views are one of those things that took me a little while to grasp. They're a little weird. At first I figured your template talks directly to your controller talks to your model, you have components, so why do you need views? Well, there's this really neat article in the Ember documentation called the view layer. It goes really in depth about describing how Ember uses views to build your application. After reading it through 3 or 10 times, I think I finally have kind of a decent understanding of how Ember uses views, why it needs views, and when you should use a view yourself. And the last thing I want to mention as a learning moment is Ember CLI generators. Ember CLI generators allow you to basically take some boilerplate code and just run a command that will create an object or of a given type. So I just say Ember generate controller, and you have a controller. The learning moment for me was that I realized I can make my own generators. So I created a generator to create a card type, and this involves creating 6 or 7 different files that are controllers, templates, and tests, and then that basically reduces a whole lot of the manual typing I would have otherwise had to do. So other than that, our experience, I would say, with Ember has been overwhelmingly positive, and we're all looking forward to continuing to work with the community in the future.
Thank you. If you want to just follow any updates that we have as we develop our software, just check out simply360.com. The holding page is up there right now, and a little newsletter sign up. So we'd love to hear from you. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Anybody have any questions for Jake or Chris before we move on? Okay, cool. Thanks. That looks great. Good luck. All right, so let's get Ivan to come up and plug in. I wanted to mention to all of you while Ivan gets set up that we have a little surprise tonight. Between Ivan's talk and Alex's talk, we're going to do something here at EmberNYC that we haven't done in a long time at EmberNYC. So you old timers probably know what I'm talking about, and everybody else is just going to find out. So our next speaker is works at one of the New York City's fastest growing companies in general, I think, and they're in the hosting space. There's a company called DigitalOcean, and if you haven't heard of them, you certainly will very soon, I'm sure. But they have, been pretty amazing to see a company enter a space that seems totally saturated and just carve out a spot for themselves and grow amazingly quickly. Tonight, I don't think we're going to hear that much about DigitalOcean, the company, but we're going to hear a bunch about what stuff that's going on inside of DigitalOcean, specifically how Ivan and his team have been using Ember and Ember CLI especially to build out functionality at DigitalOcean. So with that, I'm happy to introduce in just a moment our next speaker. I should also say that I didn't mention before, but restrooms, should you need them, there's a men's room right over here, a women's room in the back. And there are plenty more drinks in the back fridge, should you like something. Yes?
Okay. With the nonprofit data that you're working with, That's okay, I'm sorry. With the nonprofit data that you're working with, your desire to share it between nonprofits, is there not any privacy issues there?
So when we're really not, because what we're going to do is completely anonymize the data that we aggregate. So there'll be no way that you'll ever know who did what and when. We're just going to be anonymously collecting information about what people in general do, so that you can help other nonprofits that are doing the same thing get that information and understand that information. But it's never going to actually be identifiable to one person.
Thanks, Jake, and thank you for the question. Thank you for filling that moment that I didn't know how I was going to fill too. So with that, I think we're ready to get going, and please join me in welcoming Ivan Vanderbilt.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along. This is only the second time I've been to the Ember meetup in New York. I'm from Australia, so I've just moved here. Figured it'd be a good time to do a talk on what we've been doing with Ember at DigitalOcean. So tonight I'm going to be talking about, well, originally it was extending applications using Ember CLI, but after sort of fleshing out this talk, I realized this was just a general, we're using Ember to extend our own applications, and I guess growing Ember into the team. So, does this thing work? Nope. All right. It's not liking me today. Alrighty. So, I'm Ivan Vanderbilt. I'm an engineer at DigitalOcean. You can find me on the internet. And this basically all came about because at DigitalOcean we get literally thousands of support tickets every day. And, you know, a fair chunk of them are kind of irrelevant. Like, they could be handled in a much easier way. People probably don't need to submit a support ticket to find out how to install WordPress or how to change their password. And so if we could reduce these kind of trivial, low-hanging support tickets by any measurable amount, would have a huge impact on the amount of time we save for our support team. So product came to me and said, can we add a help button to the control panel? And I sort of thought, okay, this could be interesting. This could be a bit of JavaScript. I haven't written any JavaScript here yet. And so I went and had a chat to the creative team. And we kind of came up with this idea that we'd throw this button on there on each page, and when you pressed it, you'd get a modal where you could search for some help articles, or maybe get presented with a list of things relating to the current page. And this all kind of seemed like pretty exciting until I took a look at the state of our current front-end code. And I looked at it a bit and thought, this is all jQuery written by guys who don't really write JavaScript. It has no tests, and it's really become the sort of jQuery that people cringe when they look at it and run away when they are tasked with implementing something on top of it. And I'm sure, like, we've all come across code like this in the past. You know, it's easy for a new guy to walk into the company and be like, oh, that's terrible, because we can all look at old code and say, that's terrible. But this was really bad. I was looking at this thing, what does this even do? So, the design we came up with was something like this. At the top, we've got a search field where you can type in some keywords and you'll get sort of an autocomplete back of, you know, things that we think you might be searching for. You know, how do I change my password? How do I, you know, rename my droplet? That sort of thing. And then below that, we've got sort of a contextual help. So if you're on the droplets page, you'll get droplet help. And that'll have, you know, how do I back up a droplet? That sort of thing. And if you're on the billing page, it'll be more like, how do I change my credit card details? Or how am I going to be billed if I use PayPal or something like that? So some of you might be skipping ahead and thinking, ooh, that sounds like it could be kind of tricky to get all that data out of there and make it relevant. And, well, yes and no. At the end of the day, the real solution was just using Elasticsearch. So Ember, it'll hit some, you know, well-defined routes. Usual get articles by tag, by query string, or directly to a known route. And Elasticsearch will just return some markdown documents which we can pass on the client side. Unfortunately, we only have one front-end developer, myself. So trying to do anything too ambitious it requires a lot of selling it to the team. And the problem was that even though we sponsored EmberConf earlier this year, we didn't have a single line of Ember code in production. So that was kind of embarrassing, and I recall that Tom Dale actually called us out on that, which that was right at the time when I joined the company. I thought, damn, I gotta change this. So I learned pretty quickly that there was no way they were going to let me rewrite our whole control panel in Ember just yet. But we could probably like get a few quick wins if maybe we started small. But as soon as I started talking about Ember, I started to get a bit of pushback from people. You know, Ember seems like it could be too heavy for this. This could very easily be done in a much simpler way. And you know, what if it slows the page down? Or what if you leave the company? Is this going to be hard to maintain? Are people going to have a hard time following on what happened here? And my personal favorite is basically the reference to just continuing as things were going. And, you know, I had to pause and really think about this. Not for too long, but I definitely stopped. And at the end of the day, our jQuery code, I hate to say it, but it generates hundreds of exceptions. And when I joined, we didn't know about this until we added Bugsnag to it and found out, oh, what's this? Like 400 emails an hour. So kind of had to put a stop there and say, we're not going to push down this road any further. We're either going to spend a lot of time refactoring this crap, which doesn't have any tests, or we could start over here fresh, kind of ditch all this technical debt on the side where it is, and do something that just might be the simplest thing that could possibly work. So the problem was that, yeah, if we keep going, that's exactly what's going to happen. We're just going to keep shipping technical debt, which somebody's going to have to deal with later on. And then when somebody else joins my team, they're not going to enjoy joining my team. So what would be the simplest thing that could possibly work here? Well, Ember CLI is pretty new. And as we're, like most of our front end is a Rails app, so going from Ember to Rails is not too much of a jump, and Ember CLI plus a CDN could just really work really well. So it got me thinking about how we could sort of pull this all together. And the problem is that inserting an Ember application into just an ordinary page that already has a whole lot of Rails views on it, it's not as simple as it seems. Because what's actually happening is Ember has absolutely no idea what else is on the page. So that kind of causes problems, because we want to have this button that you can press that loads a modal, and we want to be able to tell Ember where to put that button, and we also want to be able to pass some sort of context back to Ember about what page you're on, so it knows what help topic we're on, maybe what title to put on the help page. So we can keep the Ember app as decoupled as possible and kind of keep things as generic as possible. We need to provide this state somehow. And obviously the simplest thing we can do is to insert a JavaScript object on the page which is rendered by Rails, and it'll say, you know, title equals droplet, help, and topic equals droplets, and blah blah blah. But I just don't really like that approach. So we have this problem. We have to put this help button right here next to create droplet. But to Ember, inserting into the page, Ember doesn't know that there is even a create droplet button there. It doesn't even know there's a what element that is. It's a header tag. It's holding all that thing together. So what page are we on? How do we solve that bit of the equation? So one option would be we could look at what route we're on. We could have a hash of like all the routes that we know of on this app, and based on what they are, we could have another sort of hash of, you know, title equals blah, and sort of pull it all out. But the problem is now we're not solving the problem. We're just coupling our Ember app back to our Rails app. So the same goes for what title do we display, and I guess also for where do we insert the help button, because we have to still give Ember some context. And one solution to that would be, we could just insert the whole Ember app into the DOM somewhere where we want to put this button, and then the application view could be a link helper, you know? Something like this. We could just put that straight in there, and basically now we've got a functioning Ember app which we can, you know, click help, it can load a modal, but the problem is we're inserting this entire Ember application into what is actually back there. It's inside a header tag at the top of the page, and it means we can only really use that once. And that's something about that just doesn't quite feel right. I feel there's a better solution to this. So, going back to the traditional approach of attaching the Ember application to the body, still assuming that it knows absolutely nothing about what's going on, we can give it a few hints. And so, step 1, we need to get a help topic. Step 2, we need to start receiving events from our button, and we need, if we want to insert that button in multiple parts of the page, it might need to emit different types of events, you know, to explain. Maybe we want to launch droplet help from the top of the page, but we also want to launch billing help if somebody hasn't added their credit card details yet and they want to know how to do that. So this solution that I came up with came out of a talk I saw by Robin Ward, aka Evil Trout, which you can click, well, you can't really click on that, but you can look it up. Just search for creating a extensible Ember.js application. It was from Wicked Good EmberConf. I said Wicked Good Ruby for a second there. Wicked Good EmberConf earlier this year. And in this talk, Robin talks about creating extendable applications using Ember. But at the beginning of the talk, he mentioned something which was extending Reddit using Chrome extensions, where it basically looks for a DOM structure and it's kind of like bolts itself on there. And this is all well and good until Reddit decides to go and change their page. And the same could be said for when one of our engineers decides to go and change the markup of our control panel, and all of a sudden the help button just no longer to be seen. So the sort of middle ground I came up with was, we'll just insert a span that kind of tells us a few things about it. So we insert this as a placeholder where we want to insert these buttons. So we could insert it in the middle of a paragraph somewhere, or it could be next to the create droplet button. And we annotate it with data tags to explain to the Ember application, give us some sort of context about what's going on, what it needs to create and what it needs to give back to the user. So just so that I kind of got adoption on this from the Ruby team, created them a nice little helper. Some pretty terrible Ruby code, but hey, it works. And they can just insert that wherever they need to put one of these buttons, and it'll just create the right spans and the way it goes. So this is defining ourselves, our own client-side API. And we can use this, in addition to our server-side API, to give our application context and state without coupling it too tightly to, you know, what things might break or what URL structures might break and so forth. So now, the approach I come up with to kind of tie this together is probably not something you'd ever hear an Ember core team member condoning, but hey, I'm not an Ember core team member, so I'm going to go right ahead and show you. So what happens is, when render template gets called in our application route, because it's the first thing to get rendered, it's always going to be rendered on the page as soon as the Ember application loads. We go through things and we first look for a couple of spans that contain our role equals help button, and iterate over these and rip out the data attributes which we defined earlier on, so we get the title and the label for the button and so forth. And then we look for the factory which is going to create our help button, which is just this is the first time we've actually put any Ember onto the page. And basically take all of these attributes, including any classes we define, and we attach it to this button, or to this view. And then lastly, we insert that inside of the span we had earlier. So it's a pretty simple solution to tying it all together. But after exploring a lot of options, it might be a good idea or it might not. So, what we get here is the ability to annotate our page with anything that's an Ember view. So it could be a component, could be Ember's link view, or in our case, it was simply using just a standard Ember view. We do a couple of things in here. So we define label and topic, which are the values we passed, properties we passed in earlier. And then we've extended it with target action support so that we can trigger events. Because earlier on in the route, we attached the application controller to our view when we instantiated it. So what this means is that our view can now send events through the application stack. So basically, we're going to have a template which is going to call open help modal. And this will be able to send context throughout our application as needed. So we can have all these buttons all over the page that can basically propagate our Ember application with what we need. So that's the template, pretty tidy. Basically just hide everything on there. It just shows an icon of a help symbol. So I'll give you guys a demo of at the end. Now go forward. And so that's basically annotating our page. From here on, the rest of the help modal is just some really simple Ember. So constructing a modal is stupidly easy. We have a backdrop div, which has an action if you click it. It closes the whole thing. And in front of that, we just have this kind of container div, which we call Life Raft because we like to name things that relate to oceans at DigitalOcean. And basically, we just insert everything inside there. So we can basically, hopefully going forward, I'll say this kind of hesitantly, we'll be able to push Ember forward in a lot of other components that we use internally, both for our control panel and our internal dashboards and so forth, without having to rewrite everything from scratch. So we can extend everything that we need to extend without kind of freaking anyone out too much. And if the whole thing fails, well, we can just include Ember and go about as we were. So to get this to work initially, I was using Ember's none location, which is basically a router that doesn't affect the route. It still gives you all of the state and everything like that, but it's all in memory. So as soon as you reload the page, you lose everything. So what if we wanted to extend this a little bit? Maybe make it so that the user could click back and forward in the routes, and it's going to show the modal, close the modal, go to article, go back from an article, so forth. Well, we have all these routes defined by Rails for accessing various pages in our control panel. And, well, Ember needs to somehow annotate these. And obviously the easiest thing we could do here is use the hash location. But personally, I think hashes are ugly, and I don't really want to go down that path. I feel we can do better than that. So, what do we got? A product that is primarily aimed at developers. Random figure I made up, 97% of us are all using browsers that support History API. Could be right. Should probably check that, but so far nobody's complained. And that basically means that we can use cool technology. And one of my favorite features of Ember, and this absolutely blew me away, and the last talk kind of worked on this a little bit about the router, but we kind of don't recognize just how big a step forward the Ember router was when it came out. And being able to hook your application state up to the state of what your browser has, it's just, there's nothing else that really does that properly. So it obviously makes sense that we want to include the history location support. This introduces an interesting problem. Because now Ember needs to know about all those routes, because they're a part of the route that it's going to be matching against. And this, it was interesting that about 2 months ago there was a talk at this, the last time I attended this meetup, somebody was talking about creating routes that auto-magically matched various things programmatically. And I don't recall exactly what the solution was, but it had something to do with hacking on the error state of the router. And I explored that a little bit originally, but I thought there must just be a simpler solution. And there was a simpler solution, which was just using this sort of foo selector, where we don't have to specifically give Ember anything to fill this segment with. It's just going to use whatever it has. So yeah, we can set up these routes that Ember's going to match, and basically the help resource is just ignored. It doesn't do anything in our application. All the action happens in articles and the article. So basically, we enter from the root into articles, and then we display a list of articles and go one step deeper into article, and we show a single article. Pretty simple stuff. At the end of the day, we're all Ember developers. We know that building an application like this should be stupidly easy if it wasn't for bolting it onto top of something else. So we have droplets as one route. That's generally what you see when you load up our control panel. And then we want to link to something inside that. So if we want to launch the help page, we need to link to articles index. And surprisingly, this actually worked. And Ember will successfully navigate to droplets help articles, even though it doesn't know what the F droplets is. But it does come with a few problems. And my favorite of which is, what if we're at the index? Because now Ember doesn't have anything to fill that part of the route with, which shouldn't really be an issue, except that what happens is we get basically undefined /help/articles, which functionally as an Ember application still works. But what happens after this is when somebody goes to reload the page, our Rails backend says, what is undefined? We're getting all these 404s for undefined pages. So knowing that undefined is something that only really comes from JavaScript, it was pretty easy to kind of narrow that one down. So simple solution was on activate, we do a couple of funky things. First, we get the router's URL, and we check if the page is just root, if it's just /. And we store a default route that we're going to navigate to later on, which in this case is /droplets. If we mount this application inside our homepage at digitalocean.com, then it could just be /help, something generic that we can ignore. So something that I didn't include here, but we actually store the path that you enter at, because we're going to need that to solve the second edge case. And that is that when we navigate out of the help modal and we go back to the root, Ember is going to ignore where we came from. It's just going to say, oh, you want to go back to /. Okay. So you could have been at like settings /applications /blah, and it's just going to go back to root. So people lose their context. And then the whole thing kind of messes up when they reload the page or navigate somewhere. So to fix that, it's my little mock-up. Transition to application. To fix that, we store the route we had before and very simply just tell it to navigate back to there. Problem solved. And that close help action handler there is what gets called when you click the backdrop view, which is attached to our articles controller, I guess. And that just propagates up through to your application route. So that's basically problem solved at the end there. And so now that I've talked about that a bit, I'll give you guys a quick demo of it. Let me just mirror this again. Oh no. Sweet, actually fits on the screen. So here's the help button I was talking about. Basically gets attached to the page after page load. Pulling that off a CDN works pretty nicely. Like I said, it's an Ember CLI app. So we can launch this, and we get our contextual droplets help. You can click on articles, which nicely, because of Ember data, are entirely all loaded already. So we have all the markdown data already, and we just pass that client side, and render that client side as HTML. It's all pretty good, and we can search for things like, how do I change credit card? Get a few responses back. And basically solves the problem. I'm working on a slightly extended one, which I haven't deployed yet, which uses, was it Liquid Ember that was demoed last month? Liquid Fire, which is right here. So this is our sort of sandbox of so yeah, that's going to go out hopefully next week. Anyway, has anyone got any questions? Yep.
In your route declaration, you had a wildcard star : foo.
Yep.
I've never actually. So I know you can do star foo. I don't know if the colon means anything or just magically works, or did you try?
I don't believe
without
it does anything at all. Thanks for spotting that.
Huh. Do you think it would like magically fix that undefined thing if you got rid of it?
It's a good question.
Worth a try. Yeah, that's it. I'm
No,
just curious.
actually.
I didn't know if it actually had a functional thing. Never seen it.
All right, I'll check that out. Thanks.
Alex wrote that, in case you didn't know that.
I'm working on stuff similar where I'm bolting it onto an existing page. My question to you is, would you do this all over again, knowing what you know now?
Well, so here's the interesting thing. This whole thing I only spent 4 days on. So the time cost of it was pretty low. I'd probably tighten up some of the code a little bit. The primary goal of this was to produce something that was testable, because none of our JavaScript had any tests at this point. And it was basically the simplest thing that could work. So extending this out, there's probably a lot of learning exercises that I didn't quite discuss here that I would not do again, obviously. Yeah, I'd probably do a lot of it the same way.
Other questions for Ivan?
Yep.
So as time goes by and you decide that you want to extend it to the whole application, what do you see as the kind of would be the barriers to that? From like, how much of your code would you have to rip out, / could you keep, or how would that work?
You mean in terms of the code we currently have on our control panel and so forth?
Yeah, so if you decided that you wanted to make your entire control panel an Ember app.
So that's definitely something that I'm kind of pushing forward with. And I think it'll be on a page-by-page basis. So the real answer to that is, what do we currently do on these pages? And currently our most expensive thing that we have is our droplet create page, which has just a stupid amount of unmaintainable JavaScript in there. Like every time we launch a new region, somebody has to go in there and say, all right, so these images are available in this region, but we have to deselect these other regions, and then these applications are no longer available. There's like 4 different things that all may have to maintain state, and they're all maintain state through the DOM by just doing jQuery selectors on what has an attribute set and what doesn't. And sometimes they're strings and sometimes they're not, and it's just a pain in the neck to update. So that is one of the things we're probably going to try and get rid of first. And thankfully we have acceptance tests on that, so we can kind of say, all right, well, it still functions the same way. But if we're going to rip that out, I guess the first question is, would we be able to maybe make this help application which we load in there more generic, or would we figure out a way that we can combine 2 applications loaded at once, or maybe that 2 applications share the same vendor file and they're 2 separate Rails apps, or sorry, 2 separate Ember apps. So it would be something to explore, definitely.
Cool. Time for one more question, if anybody's got one. All right, if not, let's give a round of applause to Ivan for thanks for the talk. You know what time it is? That's right. It's time for the EmberNYC game show. So to play this game, we're going to need 10 volunteers. You need to have at least some Ember experience, as in writing some Ember code. If you'd like to volunteer, come right up here. Number 1, excellent. Garv, come on up. You don't have to raise your hand. If you get more than 10, I'll just send some people back. It's okay. One more to round it out to 10. Help me out. All right, it's going to be an unfair match then. Who's been doing Ember the longest? Just throw out how many years. All right. So Will's going to be on the team with 4 because he's got the advantage. So Will's team is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, right over here. My phone volunteers, come on up. Okay, and this team. Have you guys ever seen Family Feud? You guys know how Family Feud works? Okay. The basic idea in Family Feud, it's not the whole Family Feud, it's just kind of like who answers. The idea is that there's a rotating captain. So each round, there's going to be a different person on your team is going to be the person responsible for giving the answer. You can confer with the rest of your team, but then one person is going to give the answer, okay? Now, on Family Feud, they have these nifty buzzers. We don't have nifty buzzers, but we do have an app called I Buzzed First. If you buzz and you answer incorrectly, you lose 1 point. -1, got it? If you buzz and you answer correctly, obviously you get a point. If the other team buzzes and they miss it, the other team has a free chance to get the right answer, okay? So you can guess without having to lose a point. It's only upside for you. You guys able to join? Okay, so there's going to be one captain, one person responsible for answering on each side. So now you're probably, yeah, we can do that. We can slap this, and Alex, you're going to watch who slaps first. And then you're going to call. Well. Okay. So you're probably wondering what the theme of this quiz is going to be. The theme of this quiz is Ember computed macros. So we're going to do a little practice round so that you can so that people know A, what Ember computed macro is, and B, how the game show is going to work. So here's what's going to happen. Oh, there was a little blink effect. Okay. So here's the practice round. Now, at this point, if this was a real round, it would say round 1, 2, etc. The people who would be the captain would be standing right here with their hands ready to buzz. Okay? They would be able to consult their team here. And then I'm going to advance the slide, which is going to reveal the clue. And then when you think you know the answer, you slap. Alex calls on you, and then you give your answer. So the slap. Yeah. So you probably need to come closer. So who wants to do a practice round? Okay, Nitin and Will? Sure. Okay, so are you ready, gentlemen? Ready. Okay. So I'm going to advance the slide, and at that point, you can just be looking at the screen if you want. And at that point, whoever slaps first gets it. And what you're going to see here, as I'm advancing it now, is you're going to see some code of a computed property that doesn't use a macro. Your job is your answer must be, what is the macro that you could use to replace this code? Alex calls on Will. Okay, and then Will says,
Ember computed is empty.
Ember computed is empty. Not correct. Now you guys have a free chance. It is not Ember computed bool either. The answer is Ember computed empty. You were very close. Very close. Oh. And so in this situation, we would have -1 over here, right? Yeah. And 0 over here. Really? Doesn't matter. They get a free chance if they're the second guesser. Okay. We're now going to enter. And so now these two gentlemen will be our first round contestants. And then at that point, then we're going to rotate through the team. Okay, so get ready. We're going to do this again. Sure. Except for now, it counts. Yeah. Oh, wait. If you participate faithfully, we have Ember stickers. Okay. Oh my God, it's going to blink every time. Round 1. Eddie?
Ember computed reduced.
Ember computed reduced is not correct.
Ember.compute.sum.
Ember computed sum is correct. Now, in fairness, I just want to acknowledge to this team over here, you could use Ember computed reduce. It would just be a lot more work than using Ember computed sum. Okay, so good. Next, contestants. I don't know how I did this. Round 2. Are you ready? Okay.
Ember.computed.exists.
Not empty.
Not empty is correct. What's our count? All right, -1 to 0. The practice round doesn't count. Okay, sounds good. Yes. 0 to hero, I can feel it coming. Okay. Round 3, ready? Did anybody see? Okay, Andre.
Ember.computed.and?
Ember computed and is correct. We're in positive number territory. Round 4. Ready?
Ember got computed bool.
Ember computed bool is correct. Converts anything to a Boolean value. Okay, next contestant. Over here. Okay, round 5.
Alias.
Incorrect. I'm not a stickler for Ember.computed.
Oh, that's not.
It's not like Jeopardy.
One way.
Ember.computed one way is correct. So tell us what's the difference between Ember computed alias and Ember computed one way?
One way has no setter sides.
Exactly. So this computer, if you use it like this CP that we see up on the screen, if you use one way and you set it, it just gets squashed with whatever value you set, whereas alias would pass through. Okay, next contest. Oh, sorry, it's one way, or we would also accept the answer of reads, which is an alias to one way. Round 6.
Ember.computed.gt.
Say it again.
G-E.
Was that GE? Is this your final answer?
G-E.
GT.
GTE is correct. So GT, there's an Ember computed GT. It's greater than. GTE greater than or equal to. As you can see, that's what you would want to use for that symbol. GE doesn't exist in Ember, but you could invent it if you're dealing with multinational corporations. Thank you, thank you. I'll be here all night. Okay, let's step up for round 7. What's our count there, Alex? Whoa, -2 to 4. Okay, you guys have some ground to make up. Or Ember computed or is correct. Very good. Round 8. Ready?
Map.
Incorrect. Yes. Anybody in the audience know the answer? Go ahead, just shout it out. People, map by. Map by is the better answer. Map is a good answer, don't get me wrong, but map by or map property, which is an alias to map by. Map takes a function. Map by just takes the name of the property. Round 9, step up.
Alias.
Incorrect.
Oh, it's not alias.
This is the hardest one.
Oh, man. I don't know.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Anybody in the audience want to hazard a guess? Any core team members or contributors to core ever need to deprecate a property? This is Ember computed deprecating alias. Not something you use every day, I'll acknowledge. Okay, let's step up for round 10. Okay, are you ready?
Not.
Ember computed not is correct. You were not ready. Okay, stepping up for the next round, round 11. Everybody ready? This is a close second.
Union?
Very good, impressive. Ember computed union is correct, or its alias Ember computed unique. You don't really think about unique and union being the same thing, but turns out they are. What's that? Yes. Well, you want to be expressive, right? Okay, round 12. Do we have a contestant here on the left? Okay, ready.
LT?
LT is correct. That's less than. Okay, I think we got like 5 more. And also, if there's anybody in the audience who would like to try competing, even though you're not officially on the team, just come on up. We'll work you in.
Please.
Okay, ready. Round 13.
Read.
That read is incorrect. Free yes.
No, they already said one way. They said one way, right? Yeah. Read only.
Read only is correct. Will Bagby pulls it out. This is really useful. Read only is like, this is my go-to CP, go-to computer property macro. Whenever you want to reference something, you want to have something basically be a property that's kind of a pointer to another property, and you want to make sure that nothing in your application accidentally sets it, right? You have no use case where it should be set. Use read only because then it'll blow up if it's set, and you'll know right away. So people, you should know that. This is important. Okay, step up round 14. Start your engines.
Regex?
Regex is incorrect, although spiritually on the right track.
Match?
Ember computed match is right. This is one of these that you don't even realize exists, right? But nice. Okay, round 15. Do we have a contestant on the right? All right, here we go. And you're off.
Filter by?
Filter by is correct. So just like map and map by that we looked at before, filter and filter by are a pair of functions where the version without the by takes a function, the version with the by takes a property to compare. So this would be ember.computed.filter by shape, comma, round. Filter property is an alias. Okay, coming down the home stretch. What's our tally over here? -2 to 7. Rally caps, rally caps. Okay, we're in sudden death territory for now. Now every question is worth 3 points. Go.
Equal?
Equal is correct. 3 points for the underdogs. Round 17. I think there's only one more after this. Ready?
I'm going to try reduce.
Reduce is not correct. Ouch. Look at the intent of this code, people. You've probably written this code like this and wished you didn't one day. What's it trying to do? Concat is incorrect. So let's take a look at what this code is trying to do. So we depend on meetups at each curly brace topic and location. Who knows what this curly brace stuff means in the property, in the dependent properties here? It basically explodes, right? It is the same as saying meetups.add each topic, comma, meetups.add each location. So it means that you're observing something where you care about topic and location changing. You want to recalculate. In the first function, we're just getting a meetups, okay? Some kind of collection, probably of meetup events or something. And then we're defining a RET, usually means a return value, and it's an array. Then we're looping over each meetup. Looks like we're building a string here, right, where it's topic space at space location. And then we're pushing that string into this array, and then ultimately returning the array. So this is a more procedural way to do a map operation. And that's why originally I had this as meetups.map and just returning the string, but that kind of gives it away. So this is the thing that you would replace this with is Ember computed map. Cool. All right. What's our count going in here? All right. So you guys are within. You could tie it up. You guys could dominate. You could tie it up. It all comes down to round 18. Ready.
Property.
No.
Join?
Join, no. This one actually I had to look up. I didn't even know what it did. This is Ember computed collect, which takes whatever the set of properties that you make dependent keys, or that you pass into the macro, and joins them, it makes them an array. So I don't know where that could come in handy, but you know, it may be. So anyway, thank you everybody for playing. This has been the August 2014 edition of the Ember.js NYC game show. What's that? Oh, sweet. Sorry, my contestants, please take an Ember sticker. Okay. So we are, we've got one more talk for the night, and it's going to be a doozy. Our next speaker, I was thinking about introducing him and thinking about what he's up to and stuff like that. And I thought about my voicemail. My voicemail message on my phone, if anybody's ever called me, it says, I close out the message, it says, live with passion. And that's been my voicemail for many years. But I was thinking about it because our next speaker really does that. He throws himself in deep and intensely to everything that he does. And that's been a huge boon to the Ember community for all of his work on Ember Core and particularly the Ember router. But it's also been a great boon to our community as he explores the technology landscape and the competing frameworks out there. So those of you who weren't here for this gentleman's dive into Angular from an Ember perspective in like October or so, I think it was last year. You should go check it out on YouTube. Very insightful. And so tonight, with a deep dive into React from an Ember developer's perspective, my good friend Alex Metchenier.
All right, everybody. My name is Alex. I'm on the Ember Core team. As Luke pointed out, I had done something similar to this last October for Angular, EmberNYC. And the whole point is really just to dive in and give it a fair, non-snarky sort of overview of what it's about, what the competing philosophies are, and why it's cool, what its shortcomings are. And the plan is to do that again for React. So for what it's worth, obviously, we have the Ember hamster Tomster on the left, who is in love with KVO, key value observation, which is how all the computed properties and bindings and all that stuff work in Ember. And then there is the React logo on the right, which loves set state. Just to give you a little background, you'll learn about all these things shortly. So who am I? Again, my name's Alex. My Twitter and GitHub is MACHTY. I'm on the Ember Core team, and I work at Express Checkout. We got these shirts like a week ago, so I'm still proud. Express Checkout has been a thing since about the winter, and we've been working on sort of a suite of apps which will allow you to basically go into stores that we have integrated with and scan items on your phone and pay for them right on your phone and then walk out. So many benefits for line busting and also just kind of bringing sort of an initial technological leap, and hopefully we'll be the ones that do that. So we're going to have some developments coming up shortly. I will maybe even in the next meetup or so do a little demo, but that's sort of what I've been working on. It's got a bunch of Ember apps to it, so it's been a lot of fun to work on. So like I said, you might remember me from EmberNYC, which amazingly was like the least trolled Hacker News post of all time, given that I had to compare these things. So hopefully I can work that magic again. I don't know how I'm kind of friends with the React gang, probably more than I am with random Angular contributors, but it should be good. So anyway, so obviously, what game is this from? For anybody who knows Street Fighter 2? Anybody? So Ryut versus Kenber, and of course this dude is from the stickers that Hassan has been giving out or selling or giving out. One of them. They're over there if you want them. So if this inspires you, grab one. So React.js, what is it? Well, it's kind of the V and MVC, sort of, but definitely it's a little bit of a broad stroke definition. It does a little bit more than that. It's very cool. It was open sourced by Facebook in mid-2013, so it's been out for more than a year for everyone's consumption to use, and they were using it before that. It's currently at version 0.11.1 for what it's worth, and really, I guess, the most important thing to keep in mind there is that, well, it's pre 1.0. There's still going to be a little bit of churn, a little bit of API changes that you would have to keep track of. It's largely pretty stable. They've kind of nailed the main primitives that they care about, but every so often there'll be a little change that you need to react to. So anyway, it drives many widgets at Facebook and much of the Instagram web experience. The Atom text editor from GitHub recently switched to using that as their view layer and had many performance boosts. And there's been some people that used to really love and speak for Ember that have sort of made the conversion to React, and some of them just never want to go back. So it's really grabbed a lot of people's attention, and hopefully we can all figure out why. That's not to say that it doesn't deserve it, but it definitely works for some people. And definitely let's try to dive into that. So what is React? It is a very component-centric view layer. This chief primitive that they give you, which is a component, which of course Ember has one, but this is like their bread and butter. This is what they make you think about. Everything in React pretty much is a component. It is a very highly performant view layer. It handles many list elements on the page at the same time and often does a better job than Ember at getting that stuff on the page and very quickly making updates to many items. So it's very performant. And it also, there's a lot of patterns that it encourages to sort of get you thinking in a unidirectional data flow, which Ember kind of does actually do a pretty good job of, but this is, I think they've sort of nailed the marketing and the philosophy behind this so that everyone who's using React really knows how to structure their React applications and how data gets from one place to another. So this is sort of a cursory overview. So if it's just a view layer, why do we care? Why is this a cool thing? I mean, probably every week a new JavaScript view layer comes out. Why should we care about React? Is it just the Facebook brand? Is it anything else? So yes, there's a bunch of different view layers out there, but really there's a lot of special stuff in the philosophy and what sort of drove a lot of the design for React that is important to sort of pay attention. So I guess there's a few postulates, sort of things that if you watch any of the YouTube presentations or any of the talks about React, these sort of come up many different times, and they ultimately guide many of the design choices behind React. So one, managing state is really treacherous and error-prone and just an awful thing that you just have to do in client-side land. And the more that you can minimize the amount of state in your app or all the places that it might spread to and distribute through to your app, the better. So for instance, what do I mean by state? It could be anything from like which user, which article is currently selected, which is the article that we're looking at, and whether you're currently dragging a widget or any of these things are just state in your app, which is used to present and render your application. Sort of the postulate two is that two-way bindings, which Ember and Angular and some other frameworks are very proud of that they support, two-way bindings are actually evil. So we'll dig into that a little bit more. So there's this quality of, if you're looking at a piece of code and you, there's a way that you can describe the degree to which that piece of code is transparent. And what that basically means is that if you're going to make a change to that code, is it easy for you to reason about all the other things that are going to be affected? Like if you change this line of code, is this going to break stuff immediately close to you or something quietly way down the line because, I don't know, a null or a nil like snuck through there? And so if you can confidently say that this is a sort of well-contained with not so many crazy dependencies piece of code, and you kind of can predict what's going to happen if you change it, you could say that it is a highly transparent piece of code. And I think this also applies to reasoning about if you make changes to state in an app, is it going to go somewhere crazy all the way to the other side of the app and break some totally unrelated thing, or is it all decently well-contained and reasoned, easily reasonable? So two-way bindings, some could argue, are not very transparent. It's one thing to have data that automatically updates when it's coming from some direction, but when all the consumers of this data coming in your direction are able to make a change to that data that goes in the other direction, that's kind of hard to reason about all the different places that change could go to, and it might subtly break your app. And so React hates two-way bindings. I think something that you'll sort of notice when a new library comes out is that obviously they're going to pick and choose which features they want to support. And if there's a feature that's not in there, no matter what, even if the reasoning is good behind it, they're going to say, oh, it is awful. It's the most horrible thing. Why would you ever put that in your app? There's going to be a little bit of that. Facebook makes some good presentations. Their marketing, they've really nailed it for this stuff. I'll come back to it later. I don't think two-way bindings are quite as evil as they say. But here's a sort of general reasoning behind it. And let me just invoke some poor man's XKCD. So imagine two people are walking and they approach a river, and one says, oh, whoa, a river, and the other one says, awesome, I know some villagers downstream who really love Kool-Aid. This gives me a great idea. Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah! Starts pouring in this horrible stuff, only to realize that, shit, it went up the waterfall, it went all the way around, up the mountain, even though, the villagers are down here somewhere. But it went all the way up there, and now everybody thinks that the water has turned to blood, and everyone's freaked out, and no one really expects that to happen. That's the sort of worst-case scenario with two-way bindings, is that you drop a little bit of food coloring in there, and the whole world, the water turns into blood. So if you've read any Vonnegut, this is kind of like ICE 9. I don't want you to just drop random references, but if you don't know that, what is it, Cat's Cradle a read? Yes? Cool. Read that. Then you'll understand two-way bindings. Third postulate, data changing over time in particular is the ultimate root of all evil. There's many roots of all evil, including state in general, but state changing over time, yeah, that's the one. That's the killer. So TLDR, everything about client side, is very challenging. So what exactly does React do to design and handle this stuff, give you a framework to deal with all these difficult things? One is to basically force you into thinking of things as this unidirectional data flow. And in order to sort of encourage that and keep your code following this, they make you sort of categorize your state into two different categories. State versus props. So again, everything in React is a component. A component is going to have access to a property called states and a property called props. Sorry to call them both properties, but I think you know what I mean. It's just an object. One's called state and one's called .props. State is anything that the component sort of creates on its own and then will manage over time. And it is allowed to pass that state down to any of the child components that it creates. And I promise I'll get to some code examples soon, but it's kind of important to go over these conceptual things before dropping some crazy stuff. And so anyway, a component can materialize its own state and pass to all of its children components as properties. So if you are in a component and you say this.props, it's going to be a list of everything that was passed to you. And the rule in React is that props are immutable. You're not supposed to ever change anything that is in the .props hash. And anytime that you want to make a change to your state, which is ultimately going to result in things being re-rendered from that point onward and down to any children, you're going to call this.setState on your component. And that is going to alter your own state. That's going to alter the properties that are passed in any of the child components that you're rendering. Let me know if this is going in and out. I feel like it's done it a few times. So we know that if you're writing an app, the data can't just go downward. Hello. We know that the data can't just go in one direction. At some point, somebody's got to click a button, somebody's got to submit a form, and it's got to come back up somewhere, and you've got to make some decision. You've got to be able to get values out of an input field. So how does that work? So like if a parent renders a child form, how does it know that the form was submitted? And really, it all comes down to you can just pass callbacks everywhere. Remember that props is that hash of objects, that hash of data that was passed into you by a parent component. And that could include things like callbacks. So I could pass to a child component like button was pressed, and that'll be a function that I created. I can pass it down to it, and then when it can manage its own UI element, and when that button is pressed, it'll just straight up call that. It's almost like actions in Ember, except there's no automatic bubbling. There's no implicit, like you're firing this action on a state machine, you know, the router that, depending on which state it's in, is going to handle it differently. It's really just pretty raw, bare-bones stuff. It's just, in React, they've really ironed out this concept of state, the stuff you own, and props, which is the stuff that was given to you. And it really, there's really not a whole lot of crazy primitives in React. I'm hoping by the end of this, everyone will sort of get it. All right, so this whole state changing over time, that seems like a pretty intractable problem. It's always going to be pretty difficult to reason about. So what does React do that makes this a little bit more easy to deal with? Actually, quite easy. So imagine you were on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and you were asked which is easier, writing an app in Rails or writing a client-side JavaScript app, assuming that this is just HTML-only Rails, all server-side rendering. The answer would obviously be Rails. There's just something about it, and if you had to guess, well, every presentation has to have a meme. I apologize. Remember when you could just re-render everything every time that the server got a request? Beverage form, remembers? And that actually is really easy to do. Writing Rails app is super easy if all you're doing is generating HTML, because no matter how much of a crazy mess that you make while you're rendering and handling that request, once another one comes in, you've got a blank slate. It's just super easy. You don't have to worry about app state. None of these things that Ember and many of these other frameworks are really setting out to help you manage. So in React, when you call setState, which is just one of the few things in a component's API that you have to know about, everything from that point onward, that component, any of its children that it renders will entirely re-render. And this is sort of the magic thing, because Okay, so for instance, if you say set state color green, then everything downward, as opposed to going up the mountain where the red part is, set state color purple, everything downward is going to respond to that and update and re-render entirely. So this could even mean like set state team members, and then you've changed that array of 100 people to 150. And you would think that, wow, that's got to be pretty crazy. You're swapping out entire objects and telling the whole thing to re-render all of your children. That sounds like a lot of DOM manipulation. That sounds like a perf nightmare. Doesn't that kill performance? No. Does it mess up scrolling because you're destroying DOM elements and you're going to wind up at the top of the page and that little time before the stuff gets rendered again? No, it doesn't mess up scrolling. And yeah, there's no needless tearing down and rebuilding of DOM. So how the hell does that work? It works because of this thing called virtual DOM, which is one of the coolest parts about React. Virtual DOM is a JavaScript representation of the DOM that the browser knows about, but it's JavaScript only. It's a complete separate thing than the actual real browser API, any of the JavaScript / C++ wrappery stuff that once you get into that zone, stuff becomes horrible performance nightmare. So it's this separate tree that basically keeps track of what is currently rendering. And because it doesn't rely on the browser DOM API at all, it means things like server-side rendering are possible because Node, which doesn't have any concept of a DOM, can run this code with this virtual DOM and reason about things and basically take a virtual DOM and turn it into text. I don't really talk about that here. It's a pretty neat feature of React. It's definitely worth going into at some point. But really, the coolest part and what this ultimately comes down to every time you call setState is that when you have a virtual DOM, it is very quick in performance to perform a diff. So let me say this sort of one more time. When you first render the app, you're going to create a virtual DOM. And then it is eventually going to turn into the real DOM. It actually has to create elements, obviously, and put them on the page so you can see them. But then every time that you call setState, it is going to make a completely new version, separate virtual DOM. So now you have two trees, the pre-setState tree and the post-setState tree. And then the magic is that diffing these two trees based on some of these heuristics that they have in there to keep it from being some really intractable thing is very fast. And what that means, sure, I'm going like many slides ahead. But the idea is that ultimately when you diff two different virtual DOM trees, what that produces is a minimal change, a change set of everything that needs to happen to the real DOM to sort of get it in sync with where the data currently is. Yeah, right, okay. So basically what that means is that there's not going to be any unnecessary expensive teardown of DOM. If you rendered two list elements before and then you've set state and those two list elements are still rendered, you're not going to tear them down and rebuild them again. They're still there. The diff didn't generate a change list that said anything needed to happen to those two list elements. So scrolling is preserved. Nothing just needlessly gets torn down. Yeah, there are some, I'll kind of get into some particulars of things you have to know about to really make sure this works totally smoothly. But this is the magic behind React, because the whole DHH thing, answering the question about the Rails being an easier thing to work with, suddenly you sort of have that paradigm on the client side. You're thinking of things as re-render everything. You're not, Ember puts a lot of effort into preserving and saying, oh, I know that this list is rendered right now, and then if I insert an element into the middle of it, I'll know that I only need to produce this one change to insert a list element right there. If you actually try to apply this pattern of just like, oh, by the way, Ember, I've totally swapped out your array of players, then Ember right now is not really equipped to work that way. It's going to cause a lot of teardowns. It's going to be a really noticeable jolt as a lot of unnecessary DOM operations take place. But to be able to just easily swap out a list like that is kind of really nice. It's really easy to work with. And if you ever have any doubt about the state that your application is in, you can just be like, OK, I'm going to set state to something that I know is valid. And then it'll just kind of reset and go back to where it needs to be. And this is much of what drives the magic and what's cool about React. So that being said, there's a lot that happens in JavaScript that actually does have to entirely recalculate. As much as the DOM operations might be minimized by diffing and producing this minimal change set, every time that you call setState, it is going to call the render function of that component and all of its child components. And some of those might have like giant arrays of 1,000 things. And it might go through and loop over all of those and generate a new component based on that. And that just sounds awful, right? I mean, that just sounds like horribly inefficient. And you're doing that every time you call setState. And setState is like the one thing you have to know about React. So it turns out that, well, JavaScript is fast now. And that's not really the bottleneck. It's anything that actually manipulates the DOM that's going to make your app actually feel shitty and slow. So what about the actual diffing process? Isn't that classically, if you're going to take two different trees and actually guarantee that those nodes are the same and then pull out the ones that are actually changed, isn't that like a order n cubed operation? And well, the answer is no, because there's just enough information that you pack, that you, like in your render functions, the components that you return and some of the rules and the stuff that they can reason about there, they've sort of got that down to, I don't honestly remember what the order of n is, but it's not n cubed and it's quite fast, and it's basically so fast that you can do complex things, and it finishes within a request animation frame. So that's kind of the main thing to keep in mind, which means you can run your app at 60 frames a second, calling setState every one of those frames. So it's fast. This is, I mean, this is like the most optimized part of Ember is this diffing, and it's the one that could go the most awry, but they've put in so much time into making this fast so that you can have this nice programming model of just re-render every time. What was I saying here? Oh, well, this is a horribly placed slide. Ignore that this was here. This is probably supposed to be elsewhere. So I haven't showed you any code so far, but if you've looked at React at all, you might know that one of the most obvious things about it, and the thing that sticks out the most, is that if you look at your JavaScript code, you'll see this weird XML syntax that's embedded right in the JavaScript code, and this is called JSX. It's simply a preprocessor. It's simply a light syntactical sugar over JavaScript. And I'll show you just a comparison of JSX versus the actual generated JavaScript in just a second. It's completely optional. You don't need to know it and use it to write React apps, but what it does is sort of brings familiar HTML back. Sorry, it basically makes your components look like HTML, even though ultimately all you're returning from the render function is just a series of function calls. So specifically what I mean by that. So on your left, you're going to have, this is actual JSX. I think everything other than this class name here is valid HTML, but this is JSX. And what that turns into is this react.dom.ul, and basically the first argument that's passed in is any of the attributes that are going to decorate. So class name here obviously turns into this plain old JavaScript object of class name, and then anything else, the following arguments are going to be all the children. So for instance, we are calling this ul function, and then all the children is going to be, one's going to be an li, another is going to be an li with a class name, and the third argument is going to be an li. So ultimately, your render functions in a component are just returning some JavaScript function calls. And you don't have to use this JSX thing, and some people it just really rubs them the wrong way. I think it's actually really neat what it does, and at some point I'll tell you in this presentation, if you're going to find something to hate about React, pick something hopefully a little more illuminated than the fact that you use JSX, because JSX is pretty cool. Definitely solves some real problems. So anyways, it's all JavaScript. There's no concept of a separate template. There's no handlebars file living in another, separate from the JavaScript code. It's basically everything that gets rendered is what you return from your render function. I don't know why this is cut off. Sorry about that. So templates in handlebars and, well, any other sort of JavaScript framework, or even Ruby, often lives in a separate file. And there's this concept of it's the job of either your JavaScript or your Ruby code to sort of boil down everything that you'd like to present into this single context object. And you pass that context object to a template, and that's what's going to be used to fill in all those dynamic spaces in your template. If you have something that says hi, curly, curly, first name, depending on your context object is what's going to be used to fill in that first name. So there's no real concept of that in React. There's no boil it down to an object and pass it to a template. And for what it's worth, in Ember, usually your context object is going to be a controller or a component object. But so in React, there's no concept of a template context. Really, the context, if you're going to define that as just anything that's available at the time that you have to return some DOM or DOM functions from your render function, is just anything in JavaScript that that render function has access to, any variables that you've declared in the render function, and anything that it closes over outside of the class. So for instance, if you are using ES6 imports or require.js, those are all variables that live at the top of your file, and that's stuff that is that your render function has access to. And again, it's all just JavaScript. Just sort of keep that in mind. So here's an example. Post here is a component. React.create class is how you create a new component. And the only thing you have to define in order to create a component is this render function. That's all there is to it. It'll yell at you if you forget it or misspell it. They're pretty good about sort of letting you know where you're going awry. But to sort of explain what's going on here, we have, let's assuming common.js, we're doing, let's import this post comment component. We'll require it from elsewhere. We're going to declare our class. We're going to define our render function. And you'll see a little bit more of this. This might look strange at first, but really imagine this was just like an each helper in handlebars, a number of handlebars. And the whole purpose of this is we're going to be creating this array of these post comments, and then this is the same variable that we use here. And I think I've got some arrows to sort of explain this stuff. So for instance, we later reference and return this comments variable, which is just a variable that we've previously declared in this render function, even though it happens to return an array with these embedded post comments. And then, of course, inside this map function, we are referencing this post comment, which just happens to be this component that we've imported from elsewhere. So I really like this because I recognize that if we're going to be keeping our JavaScript code separate from our templating code, then there's going to be some things that we've already figured out how to do in JavaScript that we're going to kind of need to re-implement in handlebars. So for instance, we've got ES6 Ember CLI and Ember App Kit before it, figured out the whole ES6 imports and whatnot, and really spearheaded that. But we may or may not have to solve that problem again for handlebars. And what's nice about the whole JSX and React approach to this stuff is that it's all JavaScript. All the problems that you've already solved in JavaScript will solve all or most of your rendering needs as well, without having to take stuff that's already done in JavaScript and figure out how to do it again in handlebars. So I think everything I just said is on the slide. I'm just going to skip over that. So what are some drawbacks? I've been sort of beaming about this stuff and saying it's really amazing. There are a few things that are less well expressed in JSX. And I think in particular, anytime that you have some control flow, like an if block, it may or may not render depending on whether some condition is true. And then loops, if you're going to say in each and display every member on a team or something like that, it's a little unusual because normally what you return from render is just going to be a series of function calls, and these functions are called immediately and really just returning one giant value. But if you're going to do something with flow controls, it's like you almost need to pass in a function that might contain some components that'll get optionally called or that'll get called every time you're iterating over an array or something like that. So it usually means if you're going to do something like this that involves flow control, you've got to either split the flow control, like here is you're iterating over this and creating a component for every props.post.comments element, and then you've sort of created that, and then when you're ready to actually put it in the final return value, you reference it later. But it's kind of weird that you can't just look at this blob of what you'd normally think of as your template and just sort of get a sense of how all the nesting works and whatnot. You kind of kept things separate. It'd be really nice if you could just take what's up here and move down here, which technically you can do, but you start introducing sort of braces in here. It kind of took me a few times to get it right, and I honestly don't see this a whole lot. I see in most of the examples online people doing all the flow control stuff separate and then referencing them in their final blob of DOM that they return from render. So this is a little bit of a sacrifice that you make when you're going the full JSX route. Basically, anything that is a lambda gets weird with syntactic stuff, and it's just one of those things that templating language like Handlebars is a little better at, because Handlebars doesn't make you think whether something is a function call or that it immediately boils down to a value, or whether the thing that you're passing into a component is actually a lambda. What I mean by that is that the contents of each template from post comment cbody to /post comment is basically living inside a function that's going to get invoked for every one of these post.comments. And in Handlebars, you don't have to think about it. It's quite clean. and you just know exactly what's going on without having to even really think about JavaScript. The obvious trade-off is that you've got to learn this handlebar syntax, and there's some gotchas that can be annoying about that, and it's one more thing to learn when you're trying to build apps or learning to build apps. So, but those are just sort of some trade-offs to keep in mind. So that being said, I pointed out some cool things about this. Is JSX, in the way that React renders everything and keeps all the DOM directly inside your JavaScript code, is that just like a horrible separation of concerns? And I'm not really going to come out and say yes or no on that. If you watch a lot of the videos on this stuff, the point is repeatedly made that there's so much tight coupling between a template and the context object, which, again, in Ember is going to be your component or your controller. There's so much coupling. By that I mean, if you were to change the name of a value that you reference in your template, you would have to make sure that it actually corresponded to a change in JavaScript as well. You can't really change one and not change the other. So they're extremely tightly coupled. And that's sort of an argument that they're actually very much the same concern. And what React says is that, well, everyone's been doing it wrong. Everyone has actually been taking something that is the same concern and arbitrarily splitting it between different technologies. So, I mean, they will say this many times and argue it eloquently. I can sort of decently largely agree with keeping in mind that there are just some things that are nicer to express in handlebars. But yeah, I wouldn't really argue that it's really a separation of concern between splitting something between handlebars and, for instance, JavaScript. So hence, this is why it's really easy for everything in React to be a component, because they've said this is just the primitive that you're going to use to get everything onto the page, to handle all the DOM diffing and whatnot. And there's no concept of templates, so all that stuff can live in there as well. The only thing you have to know about is a component and what its API is, and the API is pretty simple. All you have to do is just define a render function, and anything else that you add on top of that is optional. All right, so we get it. We understand JSX. And like I said before, if you're going to hate on something in React, hopefully you'll find something more interesting to hate than JSX, because it's sort of an obvious thing to leap at. It's really kind of risky for them to say, hey, we've got this new framework, and there's a file called .jsx, and everyone's sort of afraid of XML, and it just feels kind of gross. But anyway, I'm glad that they took that risk. And again, it's optional, but it's for the designers that might have to pixel push and look at your code and have it sort of feel like HTML rather than just a bunch of React.dom.div function calls and whatnot. OK, so we're going to stop talking about JSX and get back to a little bit more about diffing and how that works with the virtual DOM. So, sorry. There are sort of just a few caveats to keep in mind, a few limitations that arguably they don't really cause that much of a problem when you're doing stuff in React. But one is that your render function has to return a single top-level element, and it can itself have many different children. You can return a single div that has a paragraph tag and a UL and all these things that are siblings under that top level, but the one thing you have to return is a single element. And the reason for that is actually something I just learned today when I talked to one of the main React dudes. It's not really super important. You can ask me about it later if you care. The constraint number 2, which is not even really a constraint, but just something to keep in mind, and you're probably not going to have your mind blown by this too much because you've been putting up with script tags for so long in Ember, which is no longer a thing for version 1.8 beta. Metamorphs are gone. Quick little round of applause for that, maybe? I think, so basically React is basically going to make sure that if you have something like, if you have dynamic content versus just like a straight up string from quote to quote, it's going to wrap all these chunks from the static hello comma space to whatever goes in here to this little character of the exclamation point. All those are going to be wrapped in spans. It's just internally how it keeps track of all these things. That might break some CSS. Your designer might be a little bit mad at you. Metamorphs in Ember were pretty annoying, but they would have less of an impact than rudely throwing spans everywhere would. But that's just something to keep in mind. Maybe at some point they'll get rid of that limitation, but it's probably going to be here for, I don't know, another year. Constraint 3, which is that there's a little bit that you have to understand and a little bit more information that you have to give to React anytime that you're rendering large lists. So for instance, if you were to take this code on the right, which just to sort of go over it real quick, is going to create this WAT component with all it does is just render. It's going to for each one of these elements, render a list element, and then render it all of that into this single UL. If you just run this code, you'll get this really awesome error message, which says each child in an array should have a unique key prop. Check the render method of WAT. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen as amazing an error code as that. It's beautiful. So anyway, I just felt this like wash of lameness come over me when I said that last sentence. So I'm just gonna move on. So going back, so what is the meaning of this key requirement? What does this actually mean? So this is where it kind of helps to go into a little bit of like, how does this DOM diffing process actually work? And so for instance, if you were to remember that every time that you re-render something in React, you're kind of re-rendering everything. You're saying your data is now this, now update yourself. So for instance, if you started off with a team of players of Candy, Mandy, Randy, and Sandy, and you decided to add a player to that, and it was sorted by name, so now there's this Newbert in the middle of that, you're going to say set state and pass in this new array. So that's going to invoke the re-render process. That's going to do all the DOM diffing stuff that I've been explaining. And it's sort of important to know how React is actually going to look at that stuff. So for instance, before you just had some player components, and I've sort of collapsed them so it's just player and doesn't reveal any of this inner DOM stuff. All React sees when it's actually looping through this stuff is like, it's a player, it's a player. Oh, that's a match. I'm going to start recursing inward and seeing if any of their children have data changes. This is a player, it's a player, this is a player, it's a player. All these things, it doesn't care, it doesn't think about whether the data actually links up. It's not going to recognize, for instance, that player 0 is name Candy or name Candy. It's really ultimately going to, the diffing that it does is only these like dynamic bits and the static bits here. But it doesn't actually consider the data that you're driving it with unless you give it a little bit more information. And the reason that this is a problem is that ultimately, when you diff two virtual DOMs, you're going to be creating this change list that should hopefully be like the minimal and most sensible amount of work that needs to happen to the real DOM in order to get it totally in sync. So, for instance, this is fine for the first two players because those haven't changed. But by the time that you start comparing this old DOM element that represents Randy with Newbert, it's not going to see, oh, this is like a totally new element. I need to insert this new player component and all of its DOM in there. It's going to think, oh, maybe this same item just changed its name from Randy to Newbert. And I'm going to, from this point onward, from Randy to Newbert and Sandy to Randy, I'm going to consider these things as just, oh, let's just from this point onward start updating each of these elements to have their updated player name. That's actually pretty inefficient, and that leads to possibly the entire array wastefully being sort of recalculated and doing a lot of churn that you don't need to do. So for instance, if you don't provide it with more information, it's going to generate this change list, which is basically update 2 to be Newbert, 3 to be Randy, and then create a new element at the end for Sandy. And what you really want to do is that, like, I've just added one player. I just want to create a new player component, any of its DOM, and insert it where it needs to go. So this is what React is yelling at you about when you see something like this. And basically, you need to give React a little bit more information when you're rendering arrays of stuff so that it can basically say, does this item need to be replaced, or is this item match a previous one and just has internal data that needs to be updated? So this is what you need to do to basically fix this problem, make this error go away. This is the sort of solution to that, is rather than just saying render player and leaving it only at this, you need to provide this key attribute. And this is how you tell React this component is associated with this piece of data. And if these match, consider them a match. And if they don't match, then maybe you need to start deleting elements or adding new elements. But you're not going to run into this problem where you're starting to just change almost every item in the array after the first one that's different. And hopefully you'll be able to turn something like this into a change list that looks like that. So it's kind of a weird gotcha that you just wouldn't have to think about in Ember, but it's also pretty well messaged. It's a very straight and to the point with a nice URL of where you need to go to get more information. And you kind of know exactly what to do, and you just get used to this stuff and remember what to do and just do it from then on. So with the last constraint, the last sort of gotcha, the interesting thing. I mean, I'm going over the stuff not to just point out all the stuff that's weird and annoying about React, but it's also you learn about how it works and why it works the way it does and all the trickery that it's done to make this thing fast. So there are other use cases, even when you're not dealing with arrays of stuff, where it's important to specify a key to say that this component is really tied to this piece of data. When it changes, I don't want you to update it and recurse into it and make changes to its data. I want you to really just get rid of it and replace it with a new one and run all of its lifecycle hooks as if it was an entirely new component. And so an instance of this is if you're doing like a form with some dynamic fields that swap out depending on a radio button or something like that, you might run into a situation where if you don't provide a key, it's just going to think the data in this same component needs to be updated, and then something that can happen is that you don't repopulate this replaced field with its default value because it doesn't see it as a new component, it just sees it as an updated one with new values. So hopefully you're starting to get a sense of how drastically different this is from how Ember sort of makes you think about things. I don't honestly think this stuff is very hard to learn and get used to. And honestly, when there's a lot of stuff in React that's just kind of cool about how it works, that when it breaks and surprises you, you're like, ah, that's because of that cool thing about how their virtual DOM works, and I sort of get it, and I will forgive you for being so awesome, even if you occasionally get it wrong. So anyway, that's about it for deep specifics of how React works. I'm not trying to just do a brain dump on every little API thing, but just all the stuff that really makes it unique from Ember. So if you care, what do I think? Because I'm just I've been pretty complimentary so far. I think it's really awesome. I think it's a totally new paradigm, which as much as it looks like just some view layer thing that everyone else has taken a stab at, they've really figured out some cool stuff. It's very performant, particularly when you're rendering lists. If you don't do optimizations that are kind of hard to reason about in Ember, React is almost certainly going to beat Ember as far as strictly performance goes. So, and then another thing that's really nice about React is that there's really not a whole lot there, yet it's very powerful relative to sort of how little code there is. Also, as a primitive to make you think about how to compose all these different things and build out your app or build out these complex components, React components are very flexible, and I can't really think of anything that I wouldn't know how to build in React, whereas Ember, I had to think a little bit more and think a little bit more about lifecycle hooks and weird issues where what happens if this binding changes in the middle of this other thing going on. So, I mean, Ember components are amazing, but there's something just a little bit, they've just figures these things out, and they also kind of make you work a little bit more closely to the DOM. Components kind of get you there, but it's still, it gets you a little bit closer to the metal when you need it, when you need that sort of granularity without actually making you muck around in some awful stuff at a too low of a primitive. So if I love this thing so much, why don't I steal all of its good ideas? Well, probably will, where it makes sense. Being able to swap out an array and have that efficiently update is actually, that's not going to be that hard to do. There's some other things that are inherently more challenging because fundamentally Ember takes an approach that is just not ever going to be in line with the assumptions made by React. But things like diffing, things like being able to swap out an array and just have that efficiently only re-render the elements that change, and rather than tearing everything down and re-rendering. I honestly don't think it's going to be that hard to do, and it just seems like something we obviously need that would add a lot of value. So just sort of maybe ask some questions. There's these all these philosophical postulates that React has sort of put forth, and it's guided their design decision making. Why would Ember be so apparently okay with two-way bindings if they're so obviously dangerous? So it's important to sort of talk about how evil they actually are. And another thing is that as much as Ember might have these two-way bindings as a primitive that you can use whenever you want it, are we really pushing that? Is that the kind of code that you write that you're always going to be thinking that, oh, the correct way to make this change in my application is to update the other end of a two-way binding? I would say that it's kind of decently constrained. Then again, Luke's favorite computed property is one called read-only, so that you don't accidentally set something and clobber some other part of your app. So I don't know. Whatever the code I write might just be different or weirder or something like that, but I don't find that I get trolled by two-way bindings all that often. But they do have their use cases, and one particular that's where it's nice to have two-way bindings is if you're dealing with forms. It's really nice to be able to, one, put an input field on the screen, have it bound to some value, and then every time that the user makes a change to that, have that come back and have that value just be set. It's just so much nicer than having to, I don't know, manually install change handlers and whatnot, which isn't to say that it's super grueling of a process in React, but it's definitely more verbose. And what's kind of weird about React is kind of weird, cool, I don't know, there's another good adjective for this, but they kind of realize that as much as two-way bindings are the devil, when you're dealing with forms, it's nice to have an abstraction that feels like two-way binding. So they have something called React Link, which cuts down a little bit of the boilerplate that you have to write to get that behavior. But if you know that, for instance, if I've been saying over and over again that the way that you change state in a React app is to call setState, then that's sort of what this little shorthand does. It's going to attach an event handler to an input field that is going to call setState based on the name that you give it to update fields. And anyway, ultimately that's what it comes down to. They give you some abstractions on top of it, but it is the kind of two-way binding that does make your life easier and not have to make you write just tons and tons of code just to get a frickin' form on the screen. So what are these use cases? This is what I talked about. I don't really want to do this React example right now. If we have time and people are curious, that's fun. We can mess around with that if anyone wants to. So what about this whole re-render everything approach that React has sort of put forth to solve the problem of state changing over time being very hard to reason about? What does Ember do to sort of help tame that beast? And I think what's important to realize is that Ember has demonstrated that it's good at taming that beast. For better or for worse, you might be really amazed, or I personally am. I'm pretty blown away by some of the simplicity of what React offers and some of the power of just re-render everything. But I've been able to write some pretty cool apps and some nice Ember code that is, I don't run into a lot of the problems that if you watch any of their videos, they'll talk about these horror stories or stuff, the problems that they had to solve in Facebook of data getting out of sync. It's just, it doesn't happen because there's whatever isn't there in React, Ember makes up with, and I would largely put that on the object model and key value observation, all the stuff that makes binding work in Ember. So it's just important even before going into this question. It's like, obviously, Ember's done a pretty good job of it because, Twitch just sold for $1 billion and all these other apps are just having just insane amounts of success, and Ember really dominates the market for giant scalable apps. So we've kind of proved it before proving how and why it works. So I think one thing that helps is that as much as we don't deprive you of two-way bindings, we do sort of make you immediately think about how to write your app in this sort of unidirectional flow. If you're writing an Ember app, the first thing you're going to be writing is router.map. You're going to define all your different states. Your routes are going to be the things that figure out what data needs to be sent down to the controllers and templates and whatnot. And the data changes flow up via actions. It's kind of not that common, nothing that I run into. I'm sure everyone's capable of doing a crazy thing just to get something shipped and out the door, and at that point you might do some crazy abuse with two-way bindings. But we kind of already have that. We kind of encourage that. I feel like when I was thinking about how all this stuff compared to other technologies, I almost feel like React is a little bit like a very functional programming language like, I guess, Scala or Haskell, and then Ember would sort of be more related to something like Ruby, which isn't actually functional, but the patterns for writing functional stuff are always there, and they are often the correct patterns, but it comes with escape hatches when you need to write something that isn't brutally verbose or just really challenging to think of any other way to do it. So the patterns are there that Ember sort of forces you into by the way it makes you write routes and think about how the data comes from this top-level route and goes down into its controllers and templates. It's not so brutally unidirectional that there's no such thing as a two-way binding, but it gets you pretty close. So in React, you have setState, which is the sort of one way, and there's maybe a few other little ways that aren't really worth talking about, to update state in your application. And it's kind of nice that setState is something that's easily greppable in your app code, because you can just be like, OK, stuff's changing, it's changing in the wrong way. I don't know why, but I can at least grep the project and see all the set states and just go through those and see which of those might be responsible for putting the app into a weird state. Whereas Ember has many different ways for you to modify an object. You have .set, set properties, and then any of the other computed properties that when invalidated might cause changes and whatnot. That said, any of the people that used to be really big in Ember that have now become super obsessed with React, I don't honestly think this is a major sticking point. Maybe they'll see this video and just totally contradict what I'm saying. I think, honestly, the big allure of React is just simplicity in general and the fact that it's pretty darn performant. But I don't honestly think that set state being the single source of where stuff changes, I don't know. Maybe I'm just writing different Ember apps than other people are, but this isn't the stuff that I really run into that really bites. So I think also another thing to keep in mind is that you have to type a little bit more, a decent amount more in React. Your code is going to be more explicit about where you're passing through callbacks. Like in Ember, you've got actions that bubble, which is actually a feature that I kind of hate, and I'm like working on changing. Ember has a repository of RFCs to sort of rip off the way that the Rust Lang GitHub repo handles its RFCs. Anyway, unrelated, I don't love everything about Ember, and actions and the way it bubbles and the sort of globally hazards that come out of that are something I don't really like about it. But in the end, Ember makes it easier for you to do more with less code. There's a lot more that you have to type in React, which for some people it is soothing that you can see exactly everything that's happening. React doesn't hold your hand as much. It's just React has done a really good job of nailing these primitives such that they're very powerful and not making you having to know too much. So I guess a good question to sort of ask at this point is that Ember is this giant thing, and React is this new thing that's come along that Facebook's made the decision to back, and Instagram has built so much stuff using, and many other people have sort of made the switch. So is it scalable? Can you write giant apps using React? And the answer that many people leap to is like, yeah, you dummy. Of course it's scalable if Facebook uses it. But I think what's sort of interesting is if you look into it more, once you start making apps that are beyond just really small components, small assemblages of components, you very quickly get to a point where you're getting away from this unidirectional data flow that React usually does a good job of brutally keeping you locked into. So this isn't even really that complicated of an example, but imagine that you're writing an app that has an e-commerce cart. And at some point, you're going to be looking at a cart details page, and it's a component, because everything's a component. But then always at the top of your page is going to be this nav bar with a sort of cart overview saying the number of items that are in that cart. Now you have this, you kind of want both of these components to be driven by the same cart model, but in order to make that work in the classic React unidirectional way, you've kind of got to find, like, you have to figure out where is this cart model going to live. All this miscellaneous top-level state doesn't actually care. I mean, maybe it does. Maybe you're writing an app where it's just the cart is so crucial to everything that why not put it on this top-level component? But it's very often the case that you just have the shared model that many different Leaf components want to know about, and it would just sort of be like an ever-fattening of a parent component state and interface to have that manage this cart and have to be responsible for funneling it through a nav bar, which funnels it down to this thing, and then on top of that you have callbacks that you need to pass through. You know, anytime that this thing wants to delete an item, or maybe there's like an undo or something like that, that's just more stuff that needs to be passed from this one shared component where the state actually lives all the way through and going through this nav bar, which doesn't want to have to care about all that stuff. So you very quickly get to a point where this data flow, this downward data flow, is kind of inconvenient, and it means just suddenly all these top-level components have to know. They sort of become these god objects of state, and maybe that makes sense if you're writing something pretty small. But if you're writing an app, it's very quickly going to sort of bloat out of control. And yeah, down here there's a shared cart model shared between both of these things. So how do you get that shared cart model into there? So this is pretty common in React. Unless you're just making React components and tying a few things together, you're probably going to run into this pretty quickly. And like I said before, what you end up having to do is finding the shared parent component where the state's going to live, and then you've got to start drilling holes and basically wiring a bunch of callbacks through them, and that's not very scalable. And suddenly you have to have a bunch of intermediate components, like what I was showing with the nav bar component, that have to sort of help out with forwarding callbacks through to child components. So it's not a very scalable model. I'm not going to say that Ember is completely immune to this, but I think there's a lot of cases where Ember data and having a sort of global side store and then having any updates to that model automatically update anybody who cares about what's happening in that model. That works honestly pretty well and doesn't, in my experience at least, lead to things surprising you with state changes when you're not expecting them. Maybe other people can contradict that experience. But to actually get that done in React, I mean, you might say, okay, it's a global store. Ember data has a global store. It shouldn't be too hard to do something like that in React. But already the thing to sort of realize is that stuff isn't really unidirectional anymore. You've got some components that are kind of reaching off to the global side to grab some piece of data off the store. You can't just set state a parent component and then just have it bring everything back to a normal state because you've got all these components that are reaching some crap on the side and some global. So not that that's just awful, but it's definitely not this unidirectional thing that React says is one of the more powerful ways that they keep state in check. And also, for what it's worth, it isn't just enough to have each of those components look up one of these objects. They have to. There's no key value observation. There's no bindings in React. Everything's set state or callbacks. So even if you do manage to get this cart model to both the full-on cart detail page or the navigation bar overview thing, they both also have to go through some manual work of subscribing to changes and so on and so forth. And some people just love that verbosity. I don't mean that sarcastically. They can see, they subscribe to all the changes that they want, and they feel that they are going to be less surprised when those changes come through. But I think the key thing to keep in mind is that you get a lot of that stuff for free in Ember. It's convenient. It's such a common pattern, and there's so much convention over configuration that you don't have to do a lot of manual stuff to get that working for you. So anyways, like Facebook and Instagram, they obviously have run into this problem before, and they have had to kind of get away from the strictly unidirectional approach, and it's where a thing called Flux has come in. I'm not going to go into super great detail about this, but it's basically an admission that, yeah, not everything can be unidirectional. Not everything's going to be coming from this one shared God object component that has to unnecessarily care about all these things and have to wire all these callbacks through. So at some point, we're going to need something that lives off the side, that's going to be global, that has an elegant, decently idiomatic approach to sort of subscribing to notifications and then other things, being able to fire actions on this thing, which can cause these notifications ultimately to fire to anybody else who cares about changes in data. So I call it the sort of escape hatch in the way that, you know, I compared Ember to Ruby, and that you can write lots of functional code. Sometimes in Ruby you just need it. Okay, I know this isn't idempotent. I need side effects here. It'll just work and it'll make things be done and I can ship. I kind of see Flux as the like, okay, yeah, we get it. React, the unidirectional stuff is great, but at some point you need to get away from that. And if we're going to get away from that, we'll at least have some patterns around how to do that, and we're going to call it Flux. I think it's a little weaselly the way they present it, as if they've just totally sidestepped MVC and that they still find a way to call it unidirectional. And I welcome any criticism that anyone has if they see this video, if I'm really conveying it incorrectly. But even if you go to the repo or the documentation about it, they will admit it's kind of more of a pattern than a framework. And that's because there's a lot of just boilerplate code that you kind of have to copy yourself and write your own dispatcher and your own sort of approach to pub sub. And Flux isn't just the only one out there. I feel like if you're going to be, there's almost like a badge that you get if you use React and you've written your own version of Flux, because a bunch of them have already come out. There's Flux, there's Reflux, there's Flux. Yeah, whatever. I could probably start cussing. And they all involve some variation of like pub sub and how you fire actions on a dispatcher and how everyone else gets that data. So again, it's not really important to understand all the details, but just keep in mind this is just like at some point your apps are going to have to reach sideways, or else you run into the problem of your parent components having to be these God objects of state. Sometimes it makes sense, and more power to you if you're writing tons of apps that are able to do that and get away with it and not have it just bloat out of control. But most cases, if you're starting to write any decently small, medium small to medium to large, you're going to have to quickly get away from that strictly unidirectional approach. So sort of visualization of what I was talking about is that rather than having everything live on a God object, you have the cart details page and nav cart, the components, reference some store, however you want to do it, whether you're using Flux, Reflux, or whatever. Again, not strictly unidirectional and maybe a little error prone in some cases. And I don't think Flux is kind of a moving target, and there's so many variations of it. But it's sort of important to realize that that's how you solve this stuff. This is how you scale. Okay, that's a lot of negative stuff about Flux, Mr. Fancy Pants. But what about Ember? And I think what Ember does is that we're not going to pretend that everything's going to remain unidirectional, and I think what we do is spend a lot of time on convention over configuration on the patterns that aren't strictly unidirectional, but are still very easy to reason about. You have your Ember data or whatever you're using, whether you're using Ember model or EPF or whatever. That's going to be your store. Everyone has access to it, or at least your routes do. Hopefully nothing more than that. And from there, you know you're reaching out into some global store. But the fact that, for instance, if you have a cart object and somebody makes a change to it, and that is automatically going to result in both your cart nav overview and whatever cart page magically updating is really nice. And if you need to write more fine-grained events and subscribing to events that are happening then you can write that code if you want to. But we're not going to pretend that you can do unidirectional all the way down. We're going to spend time on the stuff that really makes it possible for you to write some giant apps that don't spiral out of control. Okay, so I should probably wrap it up at this point, but it's worth mentioning some kind of related projects that utilize React or build on React or maybe come from Ember, as in the case of the React router. So Ryan Florence is one of these Ember to React converts. Is pretty much of the opinion that now that this router exists in React, I'm probably never going to go back to Ember ever again. It just didn't really work out for his, well, I don't know what I'm talking about. But anyway, React router as an actual code base and how it fits into React is actually really nice, really elegant, and very heavily inspired by Ember. And this is the thing that made lots of people think, OK, I now know how to do giant things in, I know how to actually kind of approach a React app in the same way that I would an Ember app. And it's kind of a unique thing where you declare all of your routes in the same way. You use JSX. I mean, you don't have to because you never have to. But it's components all the way down. Your routes are components. The way that it fetches data, it might delegate it to another object. And outlets work a little bit differently, and some other things that don't totally map to Ember. But it's very well done. I like it a lot. There's a few more. It's got a little bit of churn to go through before it really nails everything. I think it leaves you wanting a little bit in handling some async, though I think some people would disagree with me. And there's a few more gotchas. And actually, I originally wrote these slides in React so that I could try out this router and try animation and all these different things. But there's just a few little gotchas that sort of made that not really totally work the way that I really wanted to. And it seemed like the kind of thing where give it another month and maybe that thing will be fixed. Ohm is, so the nice thing about React is that this re-render everything all the time is really conducive to functional programming. And in particular, I'm not the absolute expert when it comes to immutability and functional programming and where the one leaves off and the other pattern begins. But Ohm is basically ClojureScript bindings for React. And ClojureScript is basically a language that compiles down to JavaScript where all of your objects are immutable. So for instance, you can't take an array and say, I'm going to swap out this index element or pop an element off the end of it, and then that's just, you can't really do that. The way that it works in Ohm and any other framework or language that supports immutable data structures is that every operation that you do on a piece of data creates a new object that reflects that mutation. So if you wanted to add a new player to a 10-person team, you would say, array.push, and that is going to return a new array totally separate from the previous one that has 11 players. And this is Ohm and ClojureScript. ClojureScript in particular has basically made that not as crazy expensive as it sort of sounds, and duplicating all these different objects and whatnot. And it actually plugs in really nicely to React because React has this model of re-render everything all the time. And there's less state, and it just, I don't know what people try to integrate ClojureScript with before, but it seemed like a very natural fit for React. And on top of that, there's this recently, maybe in the last month or so, Facebook released this immutable library for immutable collections and maybe other data structures too. And really, the goal is to do the same thing that Ohm does, but not really couple it to ClojureScript in particular, but have it available to JavaScript as well. These are some cool things to check out. I think what's cool about React is that it's so simple and it nails a few of these things that it's sort of like ignited the imagination of all these people who have been like sitting in the corners waiting to do cool stuff with immutability. and functional programming. So some final thoughts. I think React is really great. I think everyone here should give it a shot and see what's cool about it and see how you can apply. I mean, some people that use React have said, OK, I'm still writing Ember apps, but it's the idea of recomputing everything every time in order to keep state from going out of control is a pattern that that people have started to apply to other code bases, even when they're not writing React. So it's nice. It's one of those new things that comes out that just subtly changes the way you think about stuff. And on top of that, don't be surprised if Ember steals some of the better ideas from React that actually make sense and would fit into Ember well. So that's all I got. Thank you very much.
Few questions. Who's got a question for Alex? All right, I will start it up. So in Emberland, we talk a lot about like not having truth in DOM, not having truth in URL, like, and I think I would extend that to like not having truth in views or components or templates also. But it seems like if everything's a component, then that it must be where your truth is in React. Am I thinking about that right?
Yeah, there's no controller object, and controllers are usually, the router will be in Ember is responsible for materializing the data and then passing that to controller, and then from that point on, that's where app state lives. That's the classic Ember way of thinking about things. But there is no controller in React. That state is going to live on the components, and it's sort of the trade-off that they're making, and the point that they make is that kind of like how they don't have templates because these are all the same concern. Things are so tightly coupled, and the benefits that you get from keeping it all in one place in this one single unit sort of outweigh any of the classic benefits for keeping the stuff on a controller, separate from the views that might be presenting it. I don't know. Does that help? Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I think it confirms
all that stuff that might live on a controller lives on a component.
Right. Cool. Other questions?
In the back?
Thank you. Do you have any ETA for when Ember would adopt DOM diffing?
DOM diffing? It's probably going to do like a poor man's version of it before it does anything fully React-ified. I don't know. I want to look into it. I recently shipped query param stuff, and I like the stuff so much that I'd like to bring it to Ember. So I might be one of the people working on that. But it's probably going to be a little bit blocked on getting the rest of the HTML bar stuff out the door. I know people have been talking about that for a really long time, but I think the plan is to basically we have something in like I said before, script tags are no longer a thing on 1.8 beta, and I think the plan is to get a fully realized HTML bars in for 1.9. I don't want to tie anybody to that, but it seems that you've actually hit the point where this stuff is really starting to confidently ship, and we're pretty sure we're not going to break people's apps, which is honestly where a lot of the thought sort of went into to deploying this stuff. So it might be blocked on that. It might not happen until some of this other view layer stuff is worked out and is shipped, but soon-ish.
Hi. Maybe I missed this part, but how do events bubble up in React? Like, how does user interaction end up in React? Is that just JX code and JX event handling, or?
Which kinds of events, like DOM events?
Like click event, for example.
I don't know everything about it. I know that React has basically re-implemented. They've done a lot of jQuery-ish things without relying on jQuery to re-implement event bubbling and delegation and normalizing some of that behavior. I'm sure I'm screwing that up in some way. But there's a lot of stuff that they've, in order to really plug into their DOM layer, they've kind of studied the jQuery source code and taken what they've needed to make all that stuff work.
So my event handling code is still in my JSX component.
Sorry?
My event handling code is still in the JSX component, right?
Can you be very specific? Like, what's something that you'd want to try to do, and I can maybe try to answer how you'd code it?
Well, so let's say I have a navigation bar that is a component, right? And a simple click event on that navigation bar that just
So your click's probably going to be managed by the leafmost component that actually rendered that clickable thing. I mean, it's usually you're clicking a very specific element, not just like I'm going to capture clicks in general. You could do it that way. But you're probably going to want to make that click be captured at like the component that actually rendered that DOM. And if you're curious, I can fire up that example thing that I have, and or maybe we can do that after everyone's free to go.
Okay,
but
sounds good.
Yeah, let's do that.
Cool. And while I'm walking over here, and then I'll come back, just to follow up on Nitin's question. So you have this, your event handling code, you capture the click, and then you would typically like call some callback. Is that the
Yeah, again, if you're going the strictly unidirectional way and not doing something like Flux where you can fire actions on this global thing that other things might be subscribed to, then yes, you would take a click event and then pass it to a callback that was passed in as a property. Remember, there's props, which is the immutable chunk of data that's been passed into you, and then there's state, which is stuff you make, and the way that you can pass callbacks is through props. Question?
How does React work with certain like third-party libraries that really don't like being re-rendered? I'm thinking of like something like Google Maps. I imagine that when it gets re-rendered constantly, it's going to...
Yeah, well, the thing to keep in mind is that the same reason that scrolling isn't broken or that there's not tons of DOM churn every time you call setState is because their diffing algorithm is so good. And most of the stuff, if you haven't changed the data that backs a specific DOM element, then it's not going to be changed in any way. So really all that you need to do is take enough care, and maybe you have to do some stuff with keys. I don't know, it really depends on what you're trying to do. But as long as you've set up the way that you're rendering these components in such a way that it's not going to think that the data changed on any one given component and then re-render it, then that's a pretty easy thing to do.
With React's ability to render to different backends, like strings.
Sorry, can you speak up a little louder?
With React's ability to render to different backends, not just the DOM, but say strings, that seems like it would probably have good implications for SEO, where you can render your application on the server to set it up.
SEO?
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, in that space, does Ember.js have like what's the outlook on that problem from the Ember.js perspective?
I know at one point a few months back there's somebody really trying to work on how to make HTML bars tie into server-side rendering. I haven't really looked into that in a while. Whether we figure that out and ship that, I don't know. That might be high priority, but it might be the kind of thing that since, I don't know if you know, but like a few months ago, or maybe even longer than that, Google has started to crawl complicated web apps. I have a few Ember apps that are out there where it's actually crawling dynamic content stuff that was rendered by Ember, and I'm sure it takes a penalty hit because it's not just straight up HTML, and the longer your page takes to load, it's not going to give it as good of a rating as something that's just server-side rendered. But if they penalize that stuff less, and if it becomes more of a thing for the Google bot to just treat an Ember app as just any other page, then it's not going to be as huge of a priority. That being said, it is nice to have fast boot where you load the page and the DOM is there. It might not be alive yet. You might not be able to click things and have the stuff. It might not be dynamic yet, but it's still a nice user experience, even if the Google bot doesn't penalize you. So I don't personally know what the priority is right now with making that work in Ember. It's more important that we ship some of these view layer refactoring stuff like HTML bars, and then might look into that again. Maybe Ebran, if you were here, he would tell me something better.
From a marketing perspective, React seems to be doing a very good job, and I always see it used in the same sentence with Angular and Ember, even though it offers a subset of the features. And also, the metaphors of immutable data and functional programming seem to be like much more complicated to understand and much less natural than like OO or MVC. Why do you think it's doing so successfully in like social media and just people talking about it there? Only talk about the speed and the good things, and like they always leave out, the data story or like the routing story, but use it in the same sentence as Ember.
The acoustics are not amazing here. What was the actual? I caught most of that, but what was the actual question?
Why do people use React in the same sentence as like Ember and Angular?
I mean, I think everyone admits that React doesn't try to do as much as Ember tries to do for you, but they basically say we've nailed all the stuff that's really tricky and often like a performance hit, and you can build stuff on top of that and not ultimately be trolled by a limitation of a view layer. Why would they put it in the same sentence? I mean, for all the other selfish reasons that anybody working on a framework wants everyone to use their stuff. But I mean, to be fair, they've really done a good job on this stuff. I think it kind of actually took them a while to find their voice, because I think they kind of came out the gates, and a lot of people were looking at JSX and kind of giving that some weird looks, and they hadn't really tapped into what's really cool and what's really changing, game changing, if you will, about React. But I don't personally mind that they put it in the same category. I'll just do my best to make sure everyone really knows why we will and will not do certain things that React tries to do, and what you can expect out of Ember as a sort of response to that.
Cool. Time for one more question, if we got one. Okay, if we don't, here's what we're going to do now. We're going to gather our things, chit-chat for 5 minutes or so, and we're going to go over to Lily's on 17th Street. It's 17th between, I always forget, I think it's 5th and Broadway, north side of the street. And so come out, have a drink, hang out, and chat with your fellow Embereños. Thank you to all of our speakers tonight. Thanks to Pivotal Labs for hosting. Thank you all for coming out. We'll see you next month.